So with that, I'd like to get started with our first session, Fishing for Security, presented by Daniel Schaeffer. Daniel Schaeffer is a non-resident scholar with the Jack Gordon Institute and a subject matter expert on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. He's a senior official of international fisheries at the Pew Charitable Trust Foundation, where he leads Pew's work on maritime security and military engagement. Before joining Pew, Daniel served in the U.S. Coast Guard, reaching the rank of commander, where he led their Fisheries and Marine Protected Enforcement Program. He holds a bachelor's degree in government from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, a master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island's College of Environment and Life Sciences, and he's a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College. Good morning, Daniel. I'd like to welcome you and give you an opportunity to provide some opening comments as well before jumping into your presentation.
Hi, good morning, Bruce. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to always talk about what I know is my favorite topic and something I have been intimately familiar with and working with for several decades now. I think it's past 30 years, a little aging on myself there. Several of the participants I recognize on here and previous work we have done, we have worked together for decades on this issue. And I hope to present to you some initial thoughts. This paper presents. By no stretch is it comprehensive and all-inclusive. It is just touching on a very complex and very difficult topic to address in any one session. So I beg your forgiveness for not touching on all topics of interest, but I did my best to be comprehensive, to start a conversation and to continue that conversation as we go forward. With that, I will begin my presentation on our paper. And I must share my screen. So for over 25 years ago, the problem of IUU fishing was seen as a significant threat to the international community. And they took extraordinary efforts, such as adoption of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement and the UN Compliance Agreement, and illustrated the importance of addressing illegal fishing at the global level. The intervening decades since then have seen interest in ensuing resource commitments both ebb and flow. And today's global community is recognizing again that the impacts of illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing are not just a fisheries issue, but a broader impact to the global community. The countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are experiencing a surge in foreign fishing activity and a rapid increase in global demand for seafood products that is impacting sustainability of the renewable resource that is fish. The loss of fisheries resources can impact food security, employment opportunities, and reduces national revenue. Fishing vessels can be associated with other nefarious crimes as well, beyond IUU fishing, to include fisheries associated and convergent crimes. Addressing IUU fishing in Latin America is wrought with challenges that include a vast maritime area to cover, limited enforcement resources, capability limitations, data analysis and sharing difficulties, legal constraints, and international frameworks that bound efforts. To overcome these challenges of IUU fisheries enforcement in Latin America, regional solutions should focus on cooperation to include interagency, regional, and international partnerships. Non-traditional partners, such as naval and security forces, should be engaged in fisheries for IUU fisheries enforcement as a gateway mission to achieve the broader aims of maritime security at the national and at the regional levels. External examples from beyond the region can provide valuable lessons in the collective efforts to address IUU fishing. This includes exploring operational cooperation at the regional level, development of regional cooperative enforcement frameworks, the incorporation of academic community and think tanks to help identify and find solutions to IUU fishing enforcement, and the use of international instruments to facilitate national and regional level cooperative enforcement. Technology and information analysis and dissemination are essential elements, but they must be applied and used as part of a solution to an existing problem and not a solution looking for a problem. Technology solutions should be evaluated for applicability, sustainability, and utility to address the problems to be solved. IUU fisheries enforcement offers an opportunity for external partners to provide value to Latin America through increased cooperation. This cooperation support can include capacity development through sustained training and engagement, development of operational resources and personnel, support for regional implementation efforts, and robust information collection, analysis, and dissemination capabilities. It is worth noting that the issues and impacts of IUU fishing, as well as any solutions to address them, must come from voices in the region. They can and should have support external, but the solutions must be led by the region. Fisheries is not just fish. The granularity and quality of data make it difficult to fully quantify the economic impacts of IUU fishing. And there's been a range of publications that provide varying levels of impacts, large staggering global numbers, such as the $26 to $50 billion in economic losses, the 1 in 5 fish sold, other numbers of the sort. Even in the region, Argentina has stated losses of over $2 billion a year to IUU fishing. And while the methodologies and absolute values may be argued and disputed, the relative impacts are agreed to be significant. But a broader perspective of the impacts of fisheries resources beyond economic losses paints an even darker reality. The price paid for fish is different than the cost, with significant repercussions that cannot readily be quantified. Combating IUU fishing is not just about preserving the country's fish stocks. It is not just about ensuring the long-term health of any particular fish species. It is about preserving a valuable renewable resource that has national security implications. For most coastal and island nations, it is imperative that they protect their fisheries resources, which are a national revenue source that helps ensure local and regional stability through improved health, better employment opportunities, and ensuring food security. Combating IUU fishing by supporting fisheries enforcement efforts has corollary benefits for providing a maritime force that can be developed as multi-mission and be able to address the full range of maritime security threats. When the topic of fisheries enforcement comes up, it is often quickly compartmentalized into a fish box and immediately sent off to the people who deal with fisheries rather than the larger governance community. Too often viewed as an environmental or conservation issue, fisheries resources have implications as both a cause for and prevention of regional instability. The external threat of IUU fishing includes a number of foreign fishing vessel fleets operating just beyond the EEZ of coastal nations, targeting squid, hake, and other species that are transboundary. This includes vessels from the European Union, China, and from nations in the region itself. Transshipment, water fishing ports, and subsidies all contribute to the issue of IUU fishing in the region. It is time to acknowledge a national and regional threat of illegal fishing as more than just fish. This competition for fisheries is even greater when small-scale and domestic commercial fishers are forced to deal with the impacts of large-scale industrial fishing. These impacts can be direct competition, destruction of habitat, or the decimation of fish stocks. Foreign fishing vessels often compete with domestic commercial fleets and are often larger, more efficient, subsidized, and operating outside established regulatory regimes. This leads to less fish for domestic commercial fishers and a loss of secure protein source for small fishers. When the ability to provide a source of food for families and communities evaporates, alternative sources will be pursued. The alternatives may be increased pressure on terrestrial wildlife, seeking fish beyond authorized areas and beyond regulatory limits, or the alternatives may be nefarious activities that provide income to buy the needed food. Their catches can be what feeds their family and their communities. It is not just fish, it is a secure source of protein, of food. When people cannot feed themselves or their families, they will seek alternatives, and some of those alternatives may be nefarious. The fish the world's population relies upon is extracted by people. It is processed by people ashore, and the value of fish only shows one level. This initial landing value does not speak to the secondary and tertiary down and upstream industries that support and are supported by the fishing industry. The suppliers that provide the fuel and stores, the boat builders, net menders, gear fixers. These are all people that contribute and are employed by secondary parts of the fishing industry. The market sellers, the processing plants, restaurants is an intricate web, and that when the fish are gone, it will collapse, taking with it entire business ecosystems and employment. When people lose their jobs, no longer have a way to provide for their families, they will seek alternatives. This may be migration, it may be other illicit activities, or maybe other industries that are just as destructive as other illegal activity. Beyond people feeding their families and making a living, the nations gain from extraction of this bulk resource. This comes from the direct sources of revenue, including access fees and taxes on the landed catch, and this provides a significant portion of a coastal nation's revenue. Even greater are the impacts derived from the industries that support and associated businesses they attract. Fisheries economic impacts can be as much as 3 times the direct monetary or economic impacts of first landing. Fisheries are base industries, with primary, secondary, and third order impacts on industries both up and downstream. This includes port facilities supporting infrastructures like food vendors, suppliers, shipyards, public utilities, government structure, and more. When a large source of government revenue derived and indirectly and directly from these extractive public resource, that is fish, it needs to be protected if those sources of funding are to remain. When the fish are gone, so is the revenue generated, and when the money is gone, the shortfall needs to be made up. It's not just fish, it's a source of national revenue both up and downstream. When the fish are gone, so is the money. And when the national revenue is gone, that shortfall has to come from somewhere. Fishing vessels are more than just engaged in fisheries. Here's an example of what else is under the nets of a fishing gear of a fishing vessel. This vessel was in international waters, and it was quite a bit of a surprise to the boarding team when they looked under the nets and in the cargo hold. In this case, it was a fishing down international waters, and this is what they found. Fishing vessels have large capacities and are ideally suited for carrying cargo, both illicit and legal. They easily blend into legitimate fishing activity. They're often active fishing vessels with an occasional side trip, so difficult to track which ones are nefarious and which ones are legal. There's more than fish that makes money. If you were to look for an expensive and low-profile way to transport drugs, an active fishing vessel is ideal. Its behavior patterns are not seen as abnormal. They are one of thousands of legitimate fishing vessels. They are hiding in plain sight. A fisherman may be approached and given no choice by traffickers, or they may be part of a larger smuggling network. It is difficult to tell. Human exploitation is huge in the fishing industry. Fishing vessels can be implicit in a number of nefarious activities that exploit humans. They operate in areas with little oversight, and what happens between the rails of the boat can easily be concealed. Traditional perspectives that the master of the vessel is the undisputed ruler pervades maritime culture. Beyond the legitimacy of human activity, what else do we see on fishing vessels? We see a violation of human rights, labor abuses, slavery and slave-like conditions, human trafficking, migrant flows, and even the flow of terrorists in and out of countries. It is worth noting, though, that the legitimacy of most fishing activities complicates enforcement. Most fishermen will abide by legal and management regimes that are perceived in their view to be fair. The industry is primarily legitimate, and it is essential that good actors are not treated as criminals, or enforcement will breed resentment and distrust and no longer be effective. Cooperation with legitimate fishing communities and actors is an essential element for enforcement success. The first step in looking at addressing the problem of IUU in Latin America is to have a baseline understanding and a definition of IUU. Within Latin America, there needs to be a universal accepted definition of the term IUU to ensure all facets are addressed, and that legal definitions adopted within each nation are harmonized with a description provided by the International Plan of Action to address IUU. And as an example of not being aligned with the IPOA is found in the United States definition of their IUU in their High Seas Drift Net Fishing Moratorium Protection Act, which is used to list and hold to account nations not taking sufficient actions to control IUU, an alternative enforcement tool. Unfortunately, the definition of IUU used within this act deviates from the International Plan of Action description and excludes activities within the EZs of other nations. This has caused significant issues when attempting to hold accountable bad actors that engage in illegal fishing in other nations' EZs. It just shows an example where it is necessary to avoid weakening regional enforcement efforts in a similar way that this lack of a harmonized definition will present. And so it's necessary to make sure that regional definition of IUU is agreed to and followed. Capacity challenges exist on a global community everywhere. No one has enough resources to conduct all operations in an ideal manner to address the problem of IUU fishing or any other maritime threat. And operating in the maritime environment presents challenges to address unwanted behavior, and enforcement of fisheries is no exception. The physical challenges include long distances, extensive ocean areas, and meteorological and oceanographic conditions that present challenges to operations. The EZs in Latin America are enormous, with the ocean areas often greater than the land areas of the nations. And as distances from logistic support bases increase, the relative capabilities of enforcement resources also increases, requiring enhanced seakeeping capabilities, endurance and speed, and communication, navigation, and detection capabilities all come with a huge price tag. The human capacity also needs increased, with more crew needed to man the vessels that are larger, operate the small boats that go between vessels and the boardings, and they need to have the ability to have capacity to handle emergencies and increased needs enforcement actions in remote areas will require. Resource constraints and capacity limitations can be difficult and multiplied when the illicit activity occurs in maritime domain. Unlike the terrestrial side, there are no boundaries. There are no set areas that people behave. It is pretty much open to activity in any one location at any time. The size of the areas to be covered make traditional policing and enforcement impractical. The tyranny of distance makes persistent physical presence difficult and expensive. To address these asset capacity limitations, the region should embrace a collective security approach underpinned by legal frameworks. The use of shipwrighter programs has been used successfully in the region for counter-drug operations and in other regions for fisheries enforcement focus. The ability to embark shipwriters to exercise authority on flag vessels extends jurisdictional reach and maximizes the limited available resources for broader collective security. Partner militaries both within and external to the region can facilitate regional cooperation through joint military exercises, such as annual UNITAS exercises, and through occasional PASEXs, such as what happened in 2018 in Ecuador and the US Coast Guard. Exercises can and should include a whole of government approach to address illegal fishing. As noted above, fisheries enforcement is a complex issue involving a number of different government agencies. So military resources are an essential element, but they must be in lockstep with other government agencies. To achieve maximum utility, all actors must work together to achieve a successful result. Integrating fisheries enforcement into military exercises requires incorporation of the full range of government agencies into those exercises, not simply the maritime entities traditionally viewed as partners. The operational constraints and challenges faced by naval and operational units need to be understood by those operating ashore, such as the prosecutors and policy and decision makers. And the knowledge gaps also need to be addressed within the operating units. They need to understand the legal proceedings and obstacles faced ashore by the same actors that support them in adjudication. Through better understanding across a range of actors, creative solutions can be identified and applied to efficiently conduct fisheries enforcement operations. A recent report by the Center for Economic and Business Research identified the importance that information sharing has in addressing the problem of illegal fishing. Their agent-based model, when ran through several thousand iterations, demonstrated the value of information sharing, even if the information sharing is limited or in only one direction. Data availability and utility of the collected data presents challenges, though. Data collection trends toward high-tech remote sensing, such as satellites and VMS tracking, but it also includes a more traditional approach to collection methods, such as sightings from aircraft, from vessels, and people ashore, radar detections, human observations, and intelligence collection. With this data comes a need to interpret the information and make it actionable. Without utility, the data loses value. Information sharing obstacles also degrade cooperative fisheries enforcement efforts. Obstacles include physical limitations in infrastructure, legal constraints on what can be shared and with whom, privacy restrictions, and the type and format of the information. Classification and protection of law enforcement sensitive information, security of existing operations, and investigations are also additional limitations to information sharing. Constraints can be across borders or between agencies. Information sharing systems may not be compatible or are unable to process the available volume of data. There are reticence to share information that comes from legitimate concerns, as well as general mistrust. There is a perception that all information needs to be shared, but that may not be the case. Information and derived products offer actionable information that facilitate cooperation and minimizes the need to protect data and expensive information sharing protocols and systems that complicate the issue. If an information sharing system is to be used, it needs to be durable. Essential for sustainability is acceptance by the region of the system as a prior information exchange system. For this to happen, there needs to be trust in the integrity of the system to be able to collect, secure, and disseminate information under appropriate security protections. There needs to be in place a way to maintain the system, and there needs to be value shown to the members for the resources committed. Legal frameworks underpin all enforcement activities, empowering agencies with authority to enforce laws and regulations. But they also provide constraints to protect the rights of citizens, legitimizing government actions and control. When legal constraints present barriers to effective enforcement, it is necessary to review the existing guidelines and work to alter the process to facilitate enforcement. Clear delineation of authorities and adjudicative procedures are essential for effective fisheries enforcement. The knowledge of judicial proceedings and the requirements for successful prosecution need to be understood by those tasked with enforcement actions. It's also necessary for the adjudicator and policy makers to understand the operational constraints faced by enforcement officials. Actions that attempt to exert control on foreign fishing vessels in areas beyond national jurisdiction are bounded by international agreements, most notably the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. Exclusive flag state jurisdiction is the underlying principle providing protection for vessels operating in the high seas, but also restricts actions by coastal states on foreign flagged fishing vessels. As an example, Article 73 of UNCLOS limits the punitive actions available to coastal nations on foreign flagged vessels for fisheries violations, even within their own EZ, prohibiting imprisonment absent an agreement that allows that action. The global community has recognized the destructive impacts of IUU and has taken significant actions to address the issue. This has included the adoption of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, the Agreement to Promote Compliance with International Conservation Management Measures by Fishing Vessels, or the Compliance Agreement, the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, the International Plan of Action to End IUU Fishing, and the Port State Measures Agreements are among those actions taken. These instruments provide a framework, but implementation has been elusive as global interest in the issue has ebbed and flowed since the adoption of the Fish Stocks Agreement. With a recent rise in awareness and calls to action to address IUU fishing, there is opportunity to fully realize the potential and utilizing these international instruments to curtail IUU fishing. At the regional level, these tools provide an overarching framework for national and regional cooperation to address the problem of IUU fishing. For parties to the agreements, the agreed actions provide the necessary legal boundaries to base national legislation and legal instruments and laws to facilitate further regional cooperation. Cooperative enforcement activities across national boundaries are limited often by existing or the absence of cooperative enforcement or legal agreements. These processes to share official information can be complicated by domestic legal systems that require formal engagement to be approved and bounded by official processes. The East African Regional Task Force Fish-Eye Africa offers an example of how operational partnerships can overcome legal impediments. Illegal fishing was rampant in East Africa with minimal capacity available and no established ways to work collaboratively within the region on this issue. Fishing vessels would move from one country to another, avoiding detection and prosecution by operating in multiple countries with little risk of being caught. The attempts to create a regional agreement for a coordinated response was elusive, but the need for enforcement continued to grow. In the fall of 2012, Fish-Eye Africa was created with a mandate to establish cooperative enforcement action against illegal fishing activity through the sharing of information and analysis and coordination of enforcement actions. This task force is a non-government-led initiative operating outside traditional political structures, focusing efforts at the operational level between fisheries enforcement agencies and operators. From the start, Fish-Eye Africa has increased regional compliance, demonstrating significant operational results, and has grown to be inclusive of all East African coastal and island nations. The success of Fish-Eye Africa comes from the underlying principle that guides their efforts. Regular meetings are essential to establish positive working relationships through trust and cooperation. The persistent process-driven way to share analysis information has created a collective knowledge base and built cohesion among members, reinforcing the concept of working together as stronger than working alone. Widely communicating successful actions and partnerships encourages collective actions. And the final element is the creation and utilization of technical assistance teams providing operational and legal support to the collective region. Within Latin America, there are examples of similar efforts that can be enhanced along the same principles of Fish-Eye Africa, such as the Global Maritime Crime Programs of the United Nations Drug Crime Office advancing the Caribbean Forum on Maritime Crime. This initiative aims to mimic similar activities of Fish-Eye Africa by coordinating technical and political efforts to address maritime crime beyond just fish at the regional level. Cooperative enforcement between nations requires the participating nations to have in place an agreement to allow and facilitate enforcement actions. A challenge to cooperation can be the limitations of not having in place adequate governing documents to facilitate joint operations and cooperative enforcement. In the Pacific, the Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreements was created to address this issue across the region. Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreements illustrates a comprehensive framework that allows for cooperative enforcement across the range of maritime threats. It establishes broad guidelines at the national level, providing leeway for the nations and operators to further refine operational procedures without having to resort to a new agreement through the arduous international mechanisms. The Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreement facilitates cooperative enforcement and surveillance through surveillance and enforcement activities and information sharing for fisheries and wider maritime law enforcement. The agreement establishes the ability to have cross-vetting of enforcement authorities, enforcement powers, and information exchange system, and sets minimum standards for information sharing. The cross-vesting of enforcement authorities enables agencies from different nations to work cooperatively on a range of operations that include at-sea patrols, aerial surveillance, collection of evidence, investigative assistance, and port inspections. It magnifies the capabilities of resource-limited but EEZ-sized challenged nations, extending authorities beyond national jurisdiction and utilizing collective actions to address a range of regional maritime threats. Formal information protocols are established in the Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreement, establishing a minimum data and intelligence sharing standards that are supported by a regional information management system administered by the Foreign Fisheries Agency. The information is required to be exchanged and allows for sharing and receiving information from the wider law enforcement community beyond just fish. Regional agreements in Latin America, similar in structure and content to the Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreement, can provide a powerful coordination tool to facilitate enforcement across the region while retaining exclusive flag state authority on vessels and citizens. This type of agreement can be used to remove barriers to cooperation and remove ability of illicit actors to flee from one jurisdiction to another. The issue of foreign fishing vessels engaged in IUU and Argentine waters provide an example of where this could have been used. Many of these vessels were operating just off the coast of Argentina, often dipping into the Argentine EEZ, but then they would be landing fish in Uruguay jurisdiction, with the inability of the Argentine enforcement to pursue those vessels into Uruguayan jurisdiction. An agreement such as a Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreement for enforcement may have allowed those vessels to be pursued and apprehended despite fleeing into Uruguayan waters. Latin America has a long history of actions to address fisheries interests, leading global efforts. The Santiago Declaration in 1952 established a 200 nautical mile fishing zone that led to the codification of the concept of that 200 mile EEZ into UNCLOS. It also created a regional coordination mechanism, the Permanent Commission of the South Pacific, that has recently begun efforts to establish a regional plan of action to combat IUU fishing in accordance with the FAO Plan of Action. Other maritime cooperation mechanisms, such as the Central American Commission of Maritime Transport, the Cooperation of Maritime Authorities for the Americas, and the Central American Fisheries and Aquaculture Organization, show the willingness and ability to apply regional solutions to address illegal fishing in the region. These existing regional coordination bodies can be adopted to utilize existing structures, including information sharing systems and existing protocols, governance structures, and legitimacy to address IUU on a regional level. Knowledge is an underlying requirement to understand and identify solutions to complex issues, including IUU fishing. The academic world offers essential knowledge that should be applied to operational problems to both identify the issues and underlying causes and help in development of practical solutions. The ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting is a military and security body of the ASEAN that guides the regional military activities of the ASEAN members. It meets annually and an established process of annual meetings, sub-meetings, and working groups. And embedded in this process is inclusion of Track 1.5 dialogues that enable the consideration of inputs and recommendations from a network of defense and security institutes and academic institutes throughout ASEAN nations. The Track 5 dialogue, 1.5 dialogues offer the opportunity for government and non-government participants to sit at the same table and have open discussions. Meetings are unofficial, non-binding, to allow open discourse and without constraint. The accompanying Track 2 dialogues are discussions without government present with academics, while Track 1.5 dialogues are dialogues related to government-only participants. The work has resulted in acceptance of a concept paper discussed in the Track 1.5 meeting that raises the awareness of efforts and direct cooperative efforts in the region and adoption of proposed guidelines for military support of solutions in ASEAN to address IUU fishing, including a new working group specifically focused on IUU. With over 1,000 think tanks in Latin America, they're some of the highest rated global think tanks in the world. And these are in Brazil, in Colombia, labs in Mexico, places in Argentina, Chile, and a number of other places. And in addition, there's a number of universities and centers of academic excellence, such as the Jack Gordon Center in FIU, that can identify and seek solutions to difficult maritime security issues that they can share with government partners, and then take forward those solutions to address the problem of IUU fishing. The need to protect fisheries, but also there's a need to protect workers in the industry. Addressing IUU fishing should include actions at the port level where the economic impacts of fishing vessels are immediate and more easily achieved than at sea enforcement alone. The global community recognizes the value of this approach and have begun to put into practice through the FAO Port State Measures Agreement. Port State Measures Agreement success is predicated on implementation by most, if not all, coastal states. A vessel must not be allowed to simply move to another port. As a first binding international agreement to specifically target IUU fishing, the PSMA is also a mechanism to facilitate regional coordination and cooperation to address illegal fishing. The PSMA eliminates the difficult step of negotiating and adopting multilateral agreements and allows countries to focus on implementation of the agreed procedures. Within these procedures are tools that can be applied more generally to problem IUU fishing, such as port inspection guidelines, sharing inspection reports, and coordination enforcement actions. At the national level, the implementation of PSMA requires and facilitates interagency coordination and offers a chance to review and revise as needed existing regulations and laws related to fisheries and associated crimes. Technology brings both positive and unintended negative aspects. When approached as a tool that is applied correctly and to the right task, technology can be a force multiplier, enhancing enforcement and compliance efforts. When it is viewed as a panacea, it will fall short of expectations and can become a drain on capacity, both physical and human. Understanding how to approach the evaluation of technology and how it can be applied is essential to gain the greatest utility and ensuring the technology does not become a drain on limited resources. The evaluation of technology begins with the identification of the problem that is being addressed, to include the need to define desired use of the technology and the end game being sought. When used as an enforcement tool, the purpose can be to achieve compliance with fisheries regulations and laws, lead to successful prosecution, or act as a deterrence to undesired behavior. It is essential to avoid a technology solution presented that is looking for a problem to solve rather than a problem being solved by the technology. A challenge to effective fisheries enforcement is the acquisition and use of actionable information. While increased data collection adds to the quality or the quantity of available information, utility of big data is limited by the ability to transform mass data into actionable form. It is akin to the internet without the powerful analytics search engines that return desired results. The early internet required users to know what they were looking for and where to find it. Those that remember AOL can know having to type in exactly what you're looking for. But now, given the amount of data available on the internet, that same approach would be impossible and would yield limited results if that were the approach given. Today, there are underpinning complex algorithms that search petabytes of data and return a tailored answer in seconds based on artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. Analysis is the key to eliminating the dark areas of data to find bad actors and illicit activity. Analysis adds utility to the vast amounts of data being collected and removes the veil of concealment from illicit activity. This involves data collection, production of evidence, and the best use of technology that collectively serves to transform subsequent analysis from mere data points on a chart to actionable information. The utility of actionable information is better achieved through the sharing of data and procedures across organizations, between nations, and having in place adequate legal frameworks to reach an endgame. The end user must be considered when examining the utility and purpose of intelligence analysis. What do they need to do their job? The short answer is a way to target sort, to narrow the focus of the actions to the highest probability of success. This does not have to be complex, and in the user end, it should not be. The purpose of operational intelligence and support apparatus is to achieve the end result of action at the operational level. Detailed analysis on generic threats has limited utility. There's little value of the intelligence reports and high-level briefings if in the end, All that exists is an educated leadership, but those in the field conducting the operations are left in the dark. Data collection and dissemination are subject to legal frameworks established to protect government, business, and citizen rights and privacy. This impacts the ability to collect and share information outside of official government use between agencies and with partner nations and organizations. The frameworks need to be understood and information sharing kept within legal bounds in order to not run counter to national privacy laws and protections of information. Adjudication procedures have unique requirements on admissibility of evidence for use in prosecuting a violation. Knowledge of the requisite format, collection methods, equipment used, and chain of custody as they relate to adjudication is essential. Legal considerations should include the acceptance of remote technology as evidence to support violations of elements of violation, required chain of custody of information, and use of foreign or non-government obtained information as legally accepted in adjudication proceedings. The durability of technology solutions ensures the invested time and physical resources used to implement the technology have a solid return on the investment. In addition to the long-term use, sustainability also requires commitment for funding, maintenance of the systems, technical training, and proficiency of the personnel using, and the infrastructure to support the use of technology. I'm going to deviate a little bit and talk about how fisheries addresses the broader issue of maritime security beyond just the fisheries part, and talk about fisheries as what I would call a gateway mission. The complexity of the maritime environment is increasing with a growing number of identified challenges to maritime governance and that include fisheries and other nefarious activities. Illegal fishing is a common threat that can offer a way to achieve broader goal of maritime national security and governance. Fisheries transcends various jurisdictions with at-sea, port, judicial, and security implications. The return on collective investment on fisheries enforcement will produce an overall maritime governance mitigating all maritime-related threats, not just fisheries. All agencies can benefit from development proficiency, and fisheries enforcement demonstrates value from the investment of resources at the national and the regional level. Top of the list is proficiency. Training and education develops skills and knowledge, and we all have seen the capacity developing efforts in the region, but it is through the exercising of the skills that proficiency is achieved. Increased iterations and exercising of operational tasks leads to expertise. With expertise comes proficiency in tradecraft. Fisheries provides an opportunity to exercise on a persistent basis the full range of military intelligence and adjudicative procedures and the apparatus from intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and dissemination on the water operations, command and control operations, and through interagency cooperation and coordination efforts. Removing the concept of fisheries as precipitating illicit activity, the mechanisms to achieve compliance for other nefarious maritime activities is the same. It is the same identification, detection, and response to a threat. The difference resides in what is being looked at and how the adjudication procedures follow. It is the same monitoring, analysis, and decision to engage a target. It is the same operational mechanisms to intercept a vessel. It is the same small boat operations and initial boarding procedures. These can all be exercised on fishing vessels, leading to proficiency of tradecraft in the maritime security realm. The rising tide of the blue economy has elevated the attention of the global community on the oceans with opportunities and threats. The lack of governance and rule of law are in stark contrast to opportunistic perspective and threat economic opportunities. Maritime forces are being asked to address these threats, which are not always a traditional mission they have focused on. Maritime security forces are being looked to by their nations to address the issue of illegal fishing. The problem is being segregated from a traditional maritime security mission. As nations are increasingly devoting attention to the impacts of the blue economy, fisheries, resources, and maritime environmental protection in general are emerging as primary focus areas for many countries, and as a result, an issue that maritime security entities are being asked to address. As a relatively new area of focus, the tyranny of distance, flag state sovereignty, and insufficient legal regimes hamper the ability to adequately address the problems. A common identified threat that limits IUU fisheries enforcement in Latin America is the ability to identify dark targets. And while dark target identification is a challenge for foreign fishing vessel incursions, these vessels are a major threat. It is not the only issue that needs to be addressed. Illicit fishing appears to be the primary problem. However, it is only a symptom the larger issue of effective governance and rule of law in areas of maritime sovereignty. The reality is that a blue water conflict is less of a threat in Latin America than the degradation of sovereignty wrought by repeated violations of national laws throughout the range of illicit maritime activities. A focus on addressing the range of maritime threats through persistent presence and action can lead to an increased perception of being detected, leading to a decrease in unwanted behavior, both illegal fishing and other nefarious maritime activities. Part of my work, I looked at how to go about addressing the problem and came up with a couple of recommendations for consideration for the region. And again, I emphasize that solutions need to come from the region and not dictated from outside, but this provides a starting point of things to consider within the region to address the problem. First is the cooperation at the interagency and regional levels. It is the only way to overcome limitations in the region of capacity and capabilities. Working together can achieve much more than working alone. Second is it will take an interagency coordination effort to adequately address the issues of IUU fishing. This is at the jurisdictional, legal, policy constraints, limited capacities, and no one agency is going to have all the authorities or the ability to conduct that mission alone. Interagency and whole of government effort is needed. If agencies cannot work together, they will not achieve effective maritime governance, particularly when it comes to dealing with the complexities of addressing illegal fishing. There needs to be the conduct of interagency tabletop exercises to fully explore the strengths and gaps in existing efforts and identify alternative approaches. And this shouldn't just be done at the national, but also at the regional level. Through these tabletop exercises, you will be able to engage and determine what gaps there are. There's no way to determine an operator to understand the adjudication if they're not sitting across and asking the questions that operations are persistently being carried out. And no way adjudication to understand the challenges that operators are facing without knowing what steps they are taking to address the issue. Only through these types of exercises will those issues really be brought to light. You need to explore external examples to derive lessons identified that can be applied in the region, such as Fish Eye Africa or the Niue Treaty Subsidiary Agreement and the Asean Track 1.5 dialogues, all examples that can be applied in the region to arrive at some solutions that may work. Multi-mission operations can be demonstrated and reinforced through regional and bilateral exercises, such as the annual UNITAS and PASEXs, like the one that was done in Ecuador in 2018, is an opportunity to use existing exercises and infrastructure to get more of a regional approach and again, interagency approach to addressing the problem of IUU maritime threat. Technology used to fight IUU needs to be evaluated and not just taken at face value to determine its utility and whether it is sustainable for use in the region. And the last is to look at fisheries as a method or as a path to achieve the larger goal of maritime governance and rule of law that transcends not just fish, but the larger issue of maritime governance in the region. The impacts of illegal fishing go beyond the loss of a secure source of food, employment, or national revenue. Beyond legitimate activities, fishing vessels can be engaged in other nefarious behaviors, including smuggling, contraband, and human exploitation. Fisheries-related crimes facilitate continued illegal fishing by concealing activity and allowing illegal fishing to flourish. Nations suffer losses of the public resource, but also loss of income from taxes and other fees. Fisheries enforcement faces significant challenges, including resource constraints, the realities of operating in the maritime environment, and information sharing. The legal frameworks of the national and international levels are complex and can constrain the ability to take enforcement action. To overcome the challenges, the problem must be a whole government approach that utilizes the different agencies' capacities, authorities, and mandates. The coordination of national efforts at the regional level further enhances fisheries enforcement impacts through collective action. The fight for fish is an opportunity for multiple nations and agencies to work together and utilize various areas of expertise to arrive at a common end. Illegal fishing, whether by distant water foreign fleets, regional fishers, or domestic fishers, have become a very real threat to the region, presenting challenges in establishing and maintaining maritime governance and protection of the region's renewable natural resources. Defense of coastal nations necessitates a focus on the maritime areas of jurisdiction and maintaining rule of law, even when the greatest threat comes from non-traditional vectors. Regional security is our collective goal, and the way to achieve it is to fish for it. And that includes my presentation on my upcoming paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate it. I was looking for my mute button there to unmute myself. Yeah, a lot of information in there, and I appreciate you framing the problem and talking about some things that can be done about it with some recommendations, as well as some areas that have been successful that we can maybe apply to problems in other regions. So for everybody, again, the Q&A chat is open. If you include questions in there, then I'll bring those up with Daniel. I'll get the conversation started, Daniel, in that illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. It's been a problem for a long time, and there's no shortage of people working on it also, but it persists. What's changed in the environment now that we think will be able to make a difference in this now?
Thank you, Bruce. That is a good question. The international community has long taken efforts to try to address, as I mentioned, through international instruments, all kinds of calls to action, all kinds of efforts to address the problem of illegal fishing in different ways. And there's also been lots of efforts that are short-term, one-off capacity building training, engagement in countries that have been short-term, that sort of approach. But what has been missing throughout the decades, and what is continuing to be missing but is showing promise, is implementation as the key to making sure that the problem of IUU is actually being addressed. So implementation requires a commitment of resources. It requires a commitment of time and sustainability to have meaningful impact. The idea of going into a nation to assist by providing training on the short term, such as a week long on how to conduct fisheries boardings, is not a sustainable solution. It is just a quick fix that does not lead to sustained efforts. However, as in the non-government community and government agencies and others are starting to see the need to implement and to have sustained implementation efforts in order to achieve those effects. The biggest example I can give recent is the efforts of the global community to implement the Port State Control Measures Agreement. That is an important effort. So it's built into the agreement to have assistance for implementation for developing countries and a fund, but you're also seeing actual sustained action on the ground throughout the last several years of adoption to see that agreement goes into place and is actually enforced, and the implementation efforts are having positive impacts. So the short answer is implementation is increasing. Implementation is the key forward to ensure success for any efforts to address IUU.
Thanks, Daniel. Again, your discussion on implementation kind of leads me to my next thought on that is what steps would you take to develop a plan to address IUU in the region?
Lots of answers. Again, as a regional solution, I would not suggest that I provide specifics, but in general, the approach I would take is a four-step approach. One is to identify the problem. You cannot solve a problem if you do not properly identify what the issue is. What are you trying to solve with the issue? Are you trying to prosecute through adjudication and traditional means of enforcement, or are you looking to deter the activity? What are you trying to achieve with your actions as a first step? And then identifying what the actual problem is. Is the problem foreign vessels? Is it domestic? Is it artisanal? Is it specific to a gear type? Is it specific to a type of fishery? These are all questions that need to be addressed through the identification of the problem itself and what the solution being sought is. The second step is to find a way to detect that problem, and that is where things like a Global Fishing Watch's tool or other mechanisms out there can help you detect the behavior and where it is happening at through both traditional and non-traditional intelligence means. Sometimes it's as simple as collecting information from local fishermen. It can be as complex as data analysis or even intelligence from other partner nations. But that detection capacity needs to be explored. How are you going to identify first, then detect? The next step is to engage that target or the actors that you're trying to affect change on. So that engagement can be traditional. Do you have the assets to board and intercept? Is the engagement through international cooperation, through things like demarches or diplomatic engagement between countries, or established procedures such as the New Way Treaty Subsidiary Agreement, where you can share information and joint actions to have a collective response? So that engagement needs to be explored, how you're going to apply that. So you identify the problem and the issue and the solution you want. You have a way to detect it, a way that works for you. You have an engagement, how you're going to engage a target. And the last step, which is very important, is what are the adjudication procedures and methodology, and what are you trying to achieve with adjudication? Traditional enforcement through the court system with fines, potentially criminal behavior associated, or are you looking to adjudicate it through IUU listing? Are you adjudicating through RFMOs, our regional fisheries management organizations, or other international instruments that can have an impact on the illicit behavior and prevent it from happening in the first place? So those are the 4 steps: is to identify, detect, engage, and then form adjudication endgame.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, no, I think that's a useful framework in order to apply to really any region on this challenge. But related, from education, what types of education or steps could be taken to help solve this problem with IUU fishing?
Yeah, this goes back to the first question you had, Bruce, of the implementation part of taking actions and calls to action and desires and implementing on the ground. When it comes to education, it is often approached in a very ad hoc sort of way, in a non-sustained way, where, as I mentioned, oftentimes good intended nations, partner nations, and even nonprofits come in and provide short-term training for a particular issue or a particular region, say on evidence collection or a particular issue on how to do a boarding, the whole range of things that may be used to address the problem of illegal fishing. But then there's not much by way of follow-up or to ensure that training that was conducted has having an actual impact on the region or an intended consequence of sustained proficiency or expertise going on. So if training and or capacity development, I hate to use the word capacity, it's an old term and it's not necessarily correct in its terminology of capacity development, but capacity or ability to conduct enforcement needs to be done through a number of steps that includes starting with identification of what the real problem is and identifying where the shortcomings are and actually conducting analysis of what the needs are for the particular problem set being solved. And then after the evaluation of that knowledge is applied, there needs to be training that is identifying those particular gaps and or working on the strengths of that target audience. They are not completely devoid of expertise or knowledge. Most of the time, there is something there they can build off of, and it is tailored to the needs of that particular country or that particular agency, and not generic to, say, a Western country coming in and trying to train on their technology, on their capacities and their training tools. It needs to be tailored to the country. Then there needs to be some sort of retention check, whether it's for proficiency of exercises and demonstration of what was trained, and then any gaps in that knowledge base that were identified in the exercise need to go back and retrained. There needs to be on-the-job training, and there needs to be a cycle where this perpetuates itself until you get a core group that is able to conduct that training to that same entity on its own, so it can be self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, and not just a one-off exchange of information. That's a short answer, and I apologize. I have so much I'd like to talk about that, but we don't have that much time today. Sorry.
No, that's understandable, Daniel. You mentioned in regional cooperation, Fisheye Africa, and there was a question in the Q&A chat as far as why is that more successful than some of the other regional mechanisms that have been implemented?
Yeah, Fisheye Africa is definitely unique. I think it formed, and the initial success was based on some very strong personalities with some influence in the region. That had the ability to get it started with a couple of countries before it expanded. From a large perspective, the reason it's sustained is it always and continues to focus on the operators themselves being a lead, being the ones that dictate what is happening and how to share the information, and develop those personal relationships. Again, having the persistent meetings in person or in virtual if you have to now to develop a trust. Initial meetings were cold, not a lot of discussion going, but as that trust developed, the open conversations began to flow. They began to trust each other, and then they were able to share information. And from that sharing of information, they demonstrated some successes of how that information sharing led to operational results in the region. And as those results continued to grow and they kept seeing the value, goes back to value for the effort put into it, they continue to cooperate together, and then it just expanded from there. So initial open communication, persistent communication, demonstrating value to the efforts and providing value back to the operators to their efforts has led to the continued success of Shy Africa.
Thanks, Daniel. There's another question that actually is specifically asked about solutions to prevent Chinese distant water fleet in IUU fishing. But in general terms, again, there are others that participate in IUU fishing. The Chinese distant water fleet certainly is the largest and so noteworthy. But what are some of the steps that might be able to be taken to prevent or mitigate some of the overfishing and these distant water fleets that are fishing in different waters? I know in some cases I've heard in other forums talk of subsidies and a lot of cooperation. But in your opinion, what are a few things that could be taken to mitigate this?
I could tell you if I had the perfect solution to that, I'd be a very happy man, but unfortunately I don't. It's very difficult because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of multifaceted ways of addressing illicit fishing by foreign fishing vessels, whether it's in the jurisdictional zones and EZs of other nations, particularly developing nations, with poor access agreements or terms that can almost be considered negligent in terms of how they were negotiated, to the activities on the high seas, to flat out illegal activity of incursions, full range of things. But I'm going to focus on one aspect only, which is I've had success in the Coast Guard years ago, and had been. I'm not in the Coast Guard anymore, so I got to stop talking as if I am. Very successful enforcement cooperation in the North Pacific, at one point with Russia, with maritime boundary line between the U.S. and Russia and Alaska, where there were multiple incursions by multiple nations, and everyone from, I was at the time, Polish, Korean, Japanese, sometimes Chinese, even Russian, coming into the U.S. EEZ, fishing across the boundary, but not being taken seriously on the Russian side. But it was through direct action between the U.S. Coast Guard and the Border Guard, which is the Coast Guard equivalent in Russia, to work as operators to determine how best to address the problem. And they came up with solutions that were beyond just the political limitations of Russia and the U.S. working at a political level. It was the operator level. Same thing with the North Pacific with China. It came down to the U.S. Coast Guard working with then the Fisheries Law Enforcement Command of China to eliminate a problem of addressing the problem of Chinese fishing vessels engaged in high seas drift net fishing in the North Pacific. But it came again down to operator level. So I would say that one of the biggest things for direct traditional enforcement is to have the operational levels speaking and working together to determine things such as evidence collection requirements, opening up lines of communication to share information directly, and to work together to find some sort of cooperative enforcement solution. And that is on the operational level. And there's some other issues that can be explored, but I'll stop at that one.
Daniel, you and I have talked separately about there have been a number of efforts, and you brought up technology and to try not to have a solution looking for a problem. But in terms of sharing information, there have been efforts for this in the past as well. Can you speak to those things that have caused us to fall short, the shortcomings of those efforts, so that maybe we could address them going forward?
I'm sorry, Bruce, you're a little bit cut off there. Were you talking about the information sharing challenges?
Yeah, that there have been efforts in the past to do some of these sharing efforts, data and information.
Oh, okay, absolutely. Yep.
But they haven't taken off, or they kind of fizzled out for different reasons. Can you explain why that is, and maybe so we can address those issues?
Absolutely. And what I think we're getting at here is the information sharing in terms of repository or a way to collectively gather information in either a particular region or a particular issue, maritime, particularly in this case, that is a way for people to access and to collect information in one location to be held a central repository, if you will, one-stop shopping, if you will, for information. And I think there have been several initiatives that have been started. Both U.S. government has started some of those. I've seen different NGOs start efforts of this sort. And the limitations have always been three main points. One being the technology applied to develop the sharing protocols and the backbone infrastructure itself for collecting, displaying, and disseminating information has not always been robust. Oftentimes it's just a spreadsheet or a collection of information on a Word document or even a rudimentary database that doesn't have a lot of technology behind it to make it robust enough to efficiently collect and present in a usable way the information that is collected. The second one being resource constraints. Often these efforts are not very well funded, and nor are they supported. IT technology is not cheap. As we all know who work in that field, it's an expensive proposition not only to develop a database that is meeting those criteria for collection and dissemination, but also to maintain it and to maintain its relevance and update on a consistent basis, which doesn't always happen. And then the third element, I think, is value added to the information. Those that are submitting information to a system like that often feel as if they're putting effort into something that has no return on their investment or no value to, at the very least, their time, let alone the resources committed to provide that information into said system. And if there's no return on the investment, the interest may be there initially. Everyone thinks it's a great idea and give great feedback to it, but as they see limited utility to themselves, they stop using, they stop promoting information. And when information stops going into these systems collectively, they become useless. They wither on the vine, they go away, and they no longer have utility because they're not maintained, they're not updated, and they're no longer relevant. So those are the three things. Ability to have the right infrastructure, a long-term sustainability for support, and the value added back to the end user.
Thanks, Daniel. Again, from a capacity issue, again, this kind of say that the areas we're talking about and the resources that are available are not enough. And so not just law enforcement, government have to get more folks involved. There's another question about how do global fish watchers support law enforcement agencies to counter illegal activity, either in real time or part of active investigations?
Was the question specifically about Global Fishing Watch or just in general?
Well, it's global fishing watchers, not specific to.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure. So how can the?
I think the question's asking is like how can others who are looking at this problem weigh in and assist with the law enforcement side?
Yeah, that presents challenges in many ways, and in a lot of it, I can't speak to each country, but in general terms, places like the Philippines, for example, have enlisted a process through the Coastal Watch system where they've enlisted the local communities to help be the eyes and ears on the water to identify abnormalities or anomalies in activity within areas that they are familiar with. So using local knowledge, knowing, hey, that doesn't look right, or this is not going on, and having a mechanism in place where that information can be readily shared with the appropriate authorities. And I think that that's the first step. Is you have a lot of folks that want to do the right thing, a lot of people who want to share information, they want to be part of the solution, but there has to be a mechanism that, again, goes back to like a database we were just talking about. It can't just be a one-way street because you have this motivation to do so, and as the information goes in and they see no actions on that, then they'll stop doing it. And then you lose the utility of that local knowledge and that local buy-in to the solution you're trying for, because they are no longer part of the solution. They're just seen as being used. So there has to be value back into. So for those who are interested in developing something like that, it has to be done in concert with the government or other entities to where the information is collected in a cohesive way, shared appropriately with the authorities that can take action, and there has to be a feedback mechanism back out to ensure that information is at least being considered, if not being used.
Thanks, Daniel. We're getting close to the our time. I'll pull one last question and then give you an opportunity to give some closing thoughts to summarize your paper and what we talked about today. But the last question, I guess, is about what are some of the U.S. efforts to increase capacity for law enforcement to prevent illegal fishing?
That is a good question. I can't speak to what the current efforts are. I can say in the past there's been, and there are certainly some documents out there and some efforts on the national level, such as the recent passage of the two different versions of the Maritime Safe Act, the one that established an interagency working group and one that required reporting requirements for some of the participants to say, this is what we're doing. In that Safe Act, it does call for increased utilization of the full interagency process to address the problem of IUU across the U.S. government. Most notably, you'll see things like the inclusion of IUU fishing in multilateral maritime exercises, the increased use of fisheries in DoD, and the use of intelligence as a way to address the problem of illegal fishing. All things that are groundworks that allow for these actions to happen. But now it comes to whether or not those allowances or those abilities are going to follow through with actions. Again, that's always the key: is where's the action, where's the follow through, where's the implementation, if you will. And the other is a recent strategy that the Coast Guard put out. There's a strategic outlook on IUU. It does set a standard that the Coast Guard will commit itself to addressing globally the problem of IUU, including partnerships with more increased shipwrighter agreements, more increased deployments in regions of interest, more capacity and or training development, and assistance in regions where they can apply their unique expertise. Those are the two major things that I see right now that the U.S. government is doing, and I know there's lots more. That's just a brief topic.
Yeah, thanks. I know it's there. You could go on all day about some of these areas. So in closing, then Daniel, I'll give you an opportunity. Any closing thoughts or things that we didn't cover today that you'd like to share with the group?
The only thing I want to share with the group is I want to reemphasize the need to approach this problem analysis from a regional perspective. It's the only way to fully understand it is to be in where this region is being impacted, how it is being impacted, and to work diligently to, yes, use lessons from outside, use knowledge from outside, use partners from outside. But the problem identification and the problem solution has got to come from the region, and has got to come from those who are impacted by it and those who are going to be the ones carrying out and implementing any identified solutions. And that's, I think, the most important thing I want to depart this conversation with.